Hi, I'm Rissel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. This is a book review for the book A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. Now, when you read about the book, a lot of places will state that the book is about Lata and her 3 suitors in India in 1950. And that's both true. It is a very that is one of the sort of red threads in the book. It's one of the sort of plot lines that go throughout the book, and a lot of the other stories are centered around finding Lata a suitable boy. But when we have a mammoth of a book, this is the Norwegian translation, and they had to it had to be posted in 2 books because it's over 1,500 pages. You then have to ask yourself, is that really what the book is about? And I think that if you think that A Suitable Boy is a love story, and you go into this book to try and find the love story, the book will keep getting in your way because saying that it's about the love story it's doing an injustice for this brilliant book. And I want to illustrate my point by going to Hamlet of William Shakespeare, just like Vikram Seth would have enjoyed immensely. Now, Hamlet, for those who do not know the play, is about Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, who is told by his fatherly ghost that the person who has killed his father is actually his uncle, who is now married to his mother. Freud also immensely enjoyed this play. Enough said about that. What happens in most adaptations of Hamlet is that there is a subplot in Hamlet that is very often cut in most film adaptations. One of the few film adaptations that hasn't cut it is Kenneth Branagh, because he didn't cut anything. And that is the fact that Denmark is actually on the verge of war with Norway when all of Hamlet is going down. Which means that when Hamlet is trying to figure out if what the ghost said is true and if his uncle is actually a murderer, what the court is seeing is that the crown prince of a kingdom is going insane while the country is at verge of going to war. Losing that subplot loses a lot of the sort of logical aspects of the book, because it means that people are weird towards Hamlet because they don't like Hamlet, rather than people are freaking out because we are almost at war and the person who's going to inherit the crown is suddenly going insane. Most people would be stressed in that situation. And losing that subplot means you're losing the complexity that Hamlet as a story can actually bring you. And I think that is one of the things you have to remember when looking at a book like this. Rather than seeing A Suitable Boy as a love story, this is a book that shows the multifaceted arenas of how India was dealing with being an independent country. So the book is set in 1951, 1952, which is when the country had its first general election. They had their independence in 1947, but India, when you've been a colony for so long, it's difficult to know, well, what are we now going to do with this freedom? How do we agree on what we're going to do? And India is a huge country. And when they went to, when they had this general election in 1951, 1952, it took almost a year to just be able to do the election, because you had so many people that were going to have to vote, and we have to decide who are these people. India was almost the sixth of the world's population at this time. So there was so many things that you need to figure out. India was changing so incredibly much. And that was both on sort of from the politicians and the laws and the election and the parties, and how do we create a democracy when 83% of the people who are able to vote can't read and write? How do we then communicate with these people in an efficient way? But also in regard to what are the laws going to be, in addition to everything else that happened in India at this time. They were trying to change the laws around who was allowed to own the country, to separate some of the larger farms so that more people were able to be farmers, and not just having all the farmland centered around a few select families. In addition to this, you also have, of course, the very, very complex situation between the Hindus and the Muslims in India at the time. Yes, a lot of the Muslims went and started living in Pakistan, but not all of them. And this very tumultuous relationship between the Hindus and the Muslims, it was relevant everywhere. Again, all the way from the politics and the laws down to who are you allowed to date, who are you allowed to be social with. There was social segregation, and sort of, and not including all of these aspects, not talking about the fact that, okay, so Latla is three suitors want Latla's hand. Latla is one of the main female characters, and one of them happens to be Muslim. And there is a lot of talk with Latla and her friends about how her family doesn't like Muslims and probably won't allow her to marry a Muslim. Now, if it's just what happens within that story, you might then read it as just simply her parents are bigoted people. But when you include the social unrest, the politicians, the law, the schooling education, and how these thoughts were in conflict throughout Indian society, it shows that what is happening within this tiny family is just a representation of something that is so much larger than just this tiny family. And it's not just about one family having to agree that a Hindu and a Muslim should be allowed to marry. It's so much more complicated than that. And that the fact that it's complicated is what makes the book so brilliant, because of its scope, because it talks about everything. So if you want a love story, then the everything is going to be uninteresting to you. And that's okay. You are allowed to sort of not want to read a book that talks about everything. I liked it. I like stories about how our societies are complex mechanisms where a lot of tiny things interact and influence one another, which is probably why I really, really enjoyed the book. Now, I know this is written within the realism genre, and I know there are a ton of things that I probably didn't pick up because I have no connections with Indian culture. But there's still so much to learn and be invested in and reflect on and all of that, even if you're not connected to Indian culture. And just simply reading about how a country decides what it means to be a free country. In parallel to everything about sort of the politicians and the land, and you have also, for example, the discussions between that the next generations don't want to copy the older generations, which is a theme that is a huge part of the 1950s in general, not just in India, because with education and with the ability to move, and you were allowed to not you're allowed to have a choice. You have a choice that you didn't have before. So you have a choice in a much larger regard as a child to not just do what your parents do and believe what your parents believe, which is also a very much a huge part of the book. And another aspect of there's so much wonderful things about the book that I enjoyed. While you're also talking about the customs and the cultures and relationships between parents and children and the lawmakers and the voters, and in all of that, there is also a huge part that talks about culture and cultural identity and identity through culture. India is a country that was very much had the British culture imposed on them, defined as that the British culture is what it means to be cultured. That is the better culture. And what then, of course, they also have to decide is what does it mean to then be cultured in an Indian sense? Do they then just say no more English, no more British culture, everything of that should be, no matter sort of who likes it or what they like, uninteresting. We should focus on, and again, what should they focus on? India is not a monolith. So they sort of talk about, okay, what languages is then the Indian language? The books and literature and the music that we're going to play, in what language should that be in to be considered good culture? How do we create an Indian voice within literature and music? And there are so many wonderful discussions in this book about that is fascinating in the sense that this book was originally written in English, and Vikram Seth is so clearly enamored with British culture at the same time as he is desperate in trying to figure out what it means to be Indian. The last thing I want to say in this review, rambling as it's now had, is that there is also a very chilling undertone in some of the scenes. They don't talk much about it, but there is still a very sort of scenes that pop up here and there with the British that has stayed behind in India. Now, these British are, for example, the ambassadors. These are the people who are doing business with India, are trying to develop connections between new Indian businessmen. And one of them and two of them are talking at a party regarding the huge conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims, where he states, and I think that is one of the more poignant scenes within the book from a realism perspective, because realism as a genre it's trying to find something real. It's trying to say something about society by not having flowery language or symbolisms or stuff like that. It's trying to show truth, and by showing truth, commenting on truth and commenting on society and reality. And as heavily influenced that the book has, and important to say, still complicated situations today in India between the Hindus and the Muslims. But when I read that scene, to me it felt like Vikram Seth was talking directly to that issue about where the anger was showing with the conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims, and where it probably should be directed. But again, I'm just a stupid white Norwegian woman, so what do I know? I'm very interested in hearing what you think if you've read the book. If you were disappointed that the book kept getting in the way of the love story. I also know that there is now a BBC series about it, but I'm hesitant to watch it because I've also heard people talking about it's being more streamlined. It's more about the love story, and whether that is then good, or if you're sort of ending up in the Hamlet situation of losing the depths because you're losing the complexity of the context of the stories. But if it's worth checking out or not, please let me know, and what do you think about it. And thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.